An experienced diver went underwater to explore an old quarry, but at the bottom he noticed the silhouette of a huge truck. As he got closer, he realized that the vehicle had been lying there for decades. But the most frightening thing awaited him inside the cab. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The morning of the dive began like so many others for Marcus Lawson, though a part of him already knew it would not end like any other. He had risen before dawn, as he always did, moving through the ritual motions of stretching, brewing a bitter cup of coffee, and checking his equipment with a soldier's precision. His apartment was silent except for the slow hum of the refrigerator and the faint hiss of the kettle. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and there was nothing to distract him from the quiet restlessness that lived inside his chest. He often thought of that restlessness as a companion, something he had carried with him since the day the Navy had released him back into civilian life, and perhaps even longer. The emptiness of a room, the meticulous order of folded clothes, the precise line of boots against the wall. These were the ways he held it at bay. Marcus had been a diver since he was 19. Back then it was duty, Navy orders, deep-sea salvage operations, where human lives and millions in equipment depended on his composure at 30 or 50 meters below the surface. He had pulled pilots from downed helicopters, recovered black boxes from shattered aircraft, and once, during a mission off the coast of Japan, helped raise the body of a friend who had not been as lucky as him. After the military, the jobs became more mundane. Private companies paid him to retrieve sunken machinery, insurance firms wanted proof of lost cargo, contractors needed men like him to certify a site before development. He told himself he did it for the money, for the simple satisfaction of work, but in truth the silence and weight of the water were the only places he felt whole. The assignment came through a local contractor. A chemical plant was scheduled to rise on the outskirts of town, and before the reservoir feeding the site could be drained, someone had to check the bottom. It was an old flooded quarry, abandoned decades ago, a black pool of water ringed by limestone cliffs and scrub pines. The foreman who briefed him had smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile, tapping the paperwork with thick fingers. Routine job, old cars, maybe some junk. You'll be in and out before lunch. Marcus had nodded and signed without a word. When he drove out to the site that morning, the fog still clung to the trees, and the quarry lay beneath it like a wound in the earth, its surface smooth and dark as oil. The men waiting for him, engineers in reflective vests, a few laborers with shovels, kept their distance. Marcus could feel the tension in the air. Even among practical men used to dirt and machinery, there was something about that pool of water that invited unease. He overheard one of them mutter, "Not right all that time under there. Things don't come back the same." Another hushed him with a look, but the words stayed. He parked his truck near the edge and began his checks. He laid out the wetsuit, the regulators, the heavy tank of compressed air, the underwater camera, the line reel. His movements were slow, practiced, almost ceremonial. The others watched, some curious, some skeptical. Marcus ignored them. Inside his head, he was already lowering himself into the water, picturing the descent, the way light would vanish in the first 10 meters, the way sound would dull until there was nothing left but the slow rasp of his own breath. Before he suited up, he walked to the cliff's edge and studied the quarry. It was deeper than he had expected, a pit carved into the land in the 1950s, then abandoned when the stone played out. Rain had filled it over decades, and the water was stagnant, tinged green with algae. The surface seemed calm, but Marcus knew it would be different below. No one could say what currents might swirl down there, what gases might rise from rotting vegetation, or what heavy machinery might be buried in the silt. He pulled on the wetsuit, zipped it, strapped on the gear. The weight of the tank pressed against his spine, grounding him. The mast slid into place. A line was fastened to his harness so the men topside could track him. Marcus dipped a gloved hand into the quarry. The water was cold, colder than he had anticipated, with a bitter mineral taste even through the latex. He did not flinch. He simply inhaled once, deeply, filling his lungs, and stepped off the limestone lip. The quarry swallowed him whole. At first there was light, greenish and fractured, bending into wavering beams as he sank. The water closed over his head, muffling the world above until it vanished completely. He adjusted his buoyancy, exhaled, and continued downward. Within 10 meters the light thinned, and the cold became more biting. He switched on his headlamp, a white spear slicing into darkness. The quarry walls loomed close, jagged cliffs of stone tapering into gloom. Strange tendrils of vegetation drifted up from the silt below, reaching like fingers. Every movement stirred clouds of debris, choking the water into opacity. He had to keep calm, moving slowly, his breathing steady. He checked his gauges, calculated his remaining oxygen. Then, as his beam swept across the floor, he saw it, something massive half buried in the muck. At first it was only a suggestion of shape, a blocky form in the shadows. He approached cautiously, sweeping the lamp back and forth. Details emerged. Chrome dulled by corrosion, a curve of metal that could only be a fender, the faint outline of wheels swallowed in sediment. His mind registered it with the same clarity he'd once used to identify wreckage on the seafloor. It was a vehicle. No, it was a truck. A wave of unease passed through him. Vehicles didn't just end up in quarries by accident. He circled slowly, brushing aside silt with his gloved hands. The lines became unmistakable. A long hood, side mirrors collapsed against the cab, the square contour of a sleeper compartment. It was a tractor-trailer rig, heavy-duty, the kind designed to haul freight across estates. Marcus floated motionless, staring. He could almost hear the echoes of an engine, the groan of gears, the hiss of brakes. His lamp swept across a door handle, still intact, though mottled with algae. The truck looked frozen in time, as if it had rolled down into this grave decades ago and simply waited. He knew he could not stay long. His tank was nearly half depleted, and the water pressed heavily at his eardrums. Reluctantly, he marked the coordinates on his wrist slate, clipped a buoy line to the fender, and began his slow ascent. The weight of the discovery pressed on him more than the water ever could. When he broke the surface, the men topside hurried to pull him in. Their voices tumbled around him, questions he ignored until he had peeled off the mask. He stood dripping on the limestone, catching his breath, then finally spoke. "There's a rig down there," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Full-sized. Been there a long time." The foreman frowned, exchanged glances with the others. One of the engineers muttered something about junked equipment, about how old mines were always filled with trash. But Marcus shook his head. He knew what he had seen, and it was no discarded loader or scrap heap. It was a truck, the kind that carried lives and stories across highways, and it did not belong at the bottom of a quarry. That night, back in his apartment, Marcus could not sleep. The image of the truck haunted him, the way it had loomed out of the silt, the way the darkness had seemed to cling to it like a shroud. He thought of his father, James Lawson, behind the wheel of his own rig. Long nights on the road, the smell of diesel and sweat and cheap coffee. He thought of the phone call that had told him his father was gone, of the weeks of silence before the body was found. The police had called it an accident. Marcus had accepted it, or tried to, but now, staring at the ceiling, he wondered if he had ever truly believed it. The quarry was not done with him. He felt it in his bones, in the steady rhythm of his pulse. Tomorrow he would go back down, this time prepared to open the cab, to see what secrets lay inside. Tonight he lay awake, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the slow ticking of the clock, waiting for morning to come. The night before his return to the quarry, Marcus hardly slept. He drifted in and out of shallow dreams, each one circling back to the same vision. The truck suspended in black water, its headlights glowing faintly as though it still sought a road above. When morning came, he rose without an alarm, his body heavy but his mind resolute. He brewed coffee, but the bitterness clung in his throat, untouched. Instead, he spent the quiet hours checking and rechecking his gear, making small adjustments with hands that betrayed no tremor, though his heart worked against his ribs like a hammer. He had been a diver for most of his life, had stared into darkness in oceans far deeper than this pit, but he could not shake the sense that the quarry was different. The sea was alive, infinite, endless. The quarry was closed, secretive, a grave with walls. When he drove out to the site again, the fog was gone, burned off by a pale sun. The quarry looked calmer in daylight, though its surface reflected the cliffs like a black mirror. Fewer men were there this time, only a couple of supervisors and a crane operator smoking by his machine. They nodded curtly, then went about their business, as though the discovery from the day before had already been tucked away in a drawer marked later. Marcus knew better. The buoy he had clipped to the fender still bobbed gently at the surface, tethered by line to the darkness below. It marked a place no one else wanted to approach. He dressed quickly, the wetsuit clinging cold against his skin. As he checked his tank, one of the supervisors, a stocky man with thinning hair, muttered, "Better not waste time down there. Boss wants the report by the end of the week." Marcus did not answer. He only slid the mast down, adjusted the regulator, and stepped into the water. The cold embraced him instantly, closing around his chest and throat like a fist. He let himself sink, exhaling to quicken his descent, eyes fixed on the narrowing cone of light from his lamp. The buoy line led him straight to the shape that had haunted him all night. It loomed larger as he approached, its cabin swallowed in silt, wheels twisted half into the muck. The windshield was a pane of green-brown slime, opaque, reflecting his light in dull smears. Marcus reached out, brushing algae from the metal, and felt the familiar thrill of touching a relic long hidden from air. He circled once, noting again the long hood, the battered grill, the mirrors folded back. There was no doubt it was a long-haul rig, at least 20 years old, maybe more. His lamp caught the faint ghost of lettering on the driver's door, the paint eaten away until only fragments of white remained. A company name once emblazoned there had been devoured by time, reduced to suggestion. Marcus steadied his breath, checked his air gauge, then braced himself. He seized the handle of the driver's door and pulled. Resistance met him at once, the weight of the water, the suction of silt. But after a long moment the seal broke with a muffled groan that echoed strangely through his bones. A swirl of sediment billowed outward, clouding the beam of his lamp. He held steady, waiting as the debris settled, then leaned inside. The sight froze him where he hovered. The driver was still there. The skeleton of a man slumped against the wheel, his seatbelt still fastened across a rib cage wrapped in scraps of fabric. The skin was long gone, but the structure of the face lingered in shadow, teeth grinning in a skull, eye sockets dark and bottomless. A tangle of hair, preserved in the stagnant water, drifted gently like seaweed. In one bony hand, curled against the thigh, a wallet still clung, its leather swollen and pale. On the dash, pressed against the grime, a photograph had adhered to the glass. A girl with bright eyes and missing front teeth, smiling toward a camera that had once meant family. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight around the regulator. He had found bodies before, men who had died in uniform, men who had drowned in storms. But there was something different about this one, trapped behind a wheel as if still driving, as if waiting for a road to open through the silt. He forced himself to move, recording each detail with the small waterproof camera clipped to his chest. Evidence mattered. Details mattered. As he leaned closer, he saw the hole. A neat, round puncture at the back of the skull, and in the seat's headrest behind it, a corresponding exit wound torn through faded upholstery. His stomach turned cold. This had not been an accident. Whoever this man had been, he had been executed. Marcus backed away slightly, chest heaving against the tank. He swept his lamp across the cab, searching for anything else. Something caught his eye near the console, a slip of paper lodged between seat and gearshift. He reached carefully, pinching it between two fingers. The water had softened it, but the ink was still legible. A diner receipt dated 20 years earlier. 2 coffees. 2 sandwiches. Marcus stared at the numbers until his vision blurred behind the mask. 2. He had not been alone that night. He tucked the receipt into a sealed pouch on his belt, then carefully pried the wallet from the skeletal hand. Inside were identification cards, credit slips, scraps of paper. He did not linger to study them. Time was oxygen, and his gauge already hovered near the red. With one last glance at the photograph on the dash, he backed out of the cab and closed the door. The sound was soft but final, like a coffin shutting. His ascent was slower than usual. He forced himself to control the pace to avoid the bends, though every nerve screamed for air. When he finally broke the surface, the men above hauled him onto the rocks. He tore off his mask and gasped, lying on his back, chest heaving. Sunlight burned his eyes and he blinked furiously until shapes came into focus. The supervisor crouched nearby, his expression tight. "Well?" he demanded. Marcus sat up slowly, unfastening the pouch at his belt. He drew out the waterlogged wallet, holding it out with steady hands. "Driver's still inside," he said hoarsely. "It's a grave, not just a wreck." The man flinched as though stung, then straightened, trying to mask his discomfort with irritation. "Then it's police business, not ours. You've done your part." He nodded to the crane operator. "We'll raise the truck when the paperwork clears." Marcus stared at him, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. They wanted the matter gone, reduced to an entry in a report. But Marcus could not shake the image of that bullet hole, of the receipt for 2 meals. He knew too well what silence did. Silence was how men disappeared. That evening, after the quarry was quiet and the workers gone, Marcus sat in his apartment with the wallet spread open on the table. He had dried the documents carefully, each one fragile with age. The driver's license bore the name Robert Keller, age 42 at the time of death. A faded family photo was tucked behind the plastic sleeve. The same little girl is on the dash, grinning with a gap-toothed smile. He traced the edges of the image with one finger, thinking of all the years that had passed since that child had lost her father. Somewhere she was grown now, carrying a wound that had never healed. The receipt lay beside it, edges curled from water. 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches. Evidence of another presence. Someone who had walked away from that night while Keller had not. Marcus stared at it until the numbers seemed etched into his vision. Whoever that second man had been, he was the key. When the phone rang, Marcus jolted. It was the foreman, his voice clipped. "Appreciate your work today. Your pay will be ready tomorrow. But listen, Lawson, you're done with this job. Let the police take it from here." Marcus made a low sound of acknowledgement, then hung up. He knew dismissal when he heard it. But the quarry had left him with more than pay. It had left him with questions, and questions had a way of gripping Marcus Lawson until he tore them into answers. That night, long after the city went quiet, he sat at his table with the wallet, the receipt, the photographs, and the memory of a skeleton strapped to a wheel. He could still see the bullet hole, clean and cruel. He knew then that he would not let it go. This was not just about a job, or even about Keller. It was about the silence that had claimed too many men, including his own father. And Marcus Lawson was not a man who lived well with silence. The morning after he dried out Robert Keller's wallet and studied every blurred line of ink on the diner receipt, Marcus felt the weight of decision pressing down on him, heavier than the dive tank had. He had been told to leave the matter to the police, to step aside and forget what he had seen. But the image of Keller's skull with that round hole in the back would not fade, and neither would the thought of the child in the photograph. There was another man, a second presence at that diner table, who had walked away when Keller never did. That knowledge burned in Marcus's chest like an ember, refusing to die. He told himself he could leave it alone, that it was no longer his business, but he knew he would not. He drove out of the city with no clear plan beyond the pull of that receipt. The diner still stood, a squat, low-roofed building off the highway, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the pale daylight. It looked almost unchanged from the year printed on the receipt, though the paint on the sign was more faded, the gravel lot more cracked. Marcus parked, sat for a long moment behind the wheel, and studied the place through the windshield. A memory stirred unbidden, the smell of truck stop coffee from his childhood when he sometimes rode with his father. He shook it away and stepped inside. The interior smelled of fried bacon and coffee brewed in pots that had seen decades of use. A row of booths lined the windows, their vinyl seats cracked and patched with duct tape. Behind the counter stood a man in his 70s with shoulders still broad, though his hair was gray and thin. He looked up as Marcus entered, his eyes sharp despite the years. Marcus ordered a coffee, sat at the counter, and after a moment pulled out the diner receipt, placing it quietly on the laminate surface. The old man leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. His face tightened as he recognized the logo of his own diner printed on the slip, though water damage had warped the paper. "Where'd you get this?" he asked slowly, suspicion mingling with memory. "From a truck," Marcus said carefully, "at the bottom of a quarry." He left the rest unsaid, but the old man seemed to understand, his mouth pressed into a hard line. "That was a long time ago," he said at last, lowering his voice. "But I remember. Driver came in, bought 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches. Sat right over there, third booth from the door. He wasn't alone." Marcus felt the world narrow to the old man's words. "Who was with him?" The diner owner shook his head. "Didn't recognize him. Never saw him again. But I remember Keller. Nice guy, quiet, one of the regulars back then. Folks said he'd stopped running certain loads. Said no to some people you weren't supposed to say no to. Not long after, he disappeared." His voice dropped further. "A few drivers vanished around those years. Word was they were given a choice. Some took it, some didn't." Marcus sat very still, the ceramic mug warm against his palms. The man's words landed like stones in his gut. Keller had not just been a victim of bad luck. He had crossed someone powerful, someone who had made him vanish. And it was not an isolated case. This was part of a pattern, a shadow stretching back decades. The old man studied him, then asked, "Why are you digging this up now?" Marcus considered lying, but the truth pushed its way out. "Because I found him, and because I think my father was one of them." The man's eyes widened slightly, then softened with recognition. "Lawson," he said slowly, "you're Thomas Lawson's boy, aren't you?" Marcus's throat tightened. He had not heard his father's name spoken aloud by a stranger in years. "You knew him?" The diner owner nodded. "Saw him a few times. He ran with Keller for a while. Good man. Always had a laugh in him, even after the long hauls. Then one night, he was just gone. Folks said it was an accident. I never believed it." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him, the past rushing in to fill the gaps he had carried all his life. His father, the man who had died in a supposed wreck when Marcus was a teenager, might not have been taken by fate at all. He might have been silenced the same way Keller had been. After a long silence, the old man sighed. You won't get far chasing this. The ones who did it are either dead or living fat and comfortable somewhere, and the ones still alive. They don't like questions. But Marcus had already decided. He left a generous tip on the counter, thanked the man, and walked out into the bright noon sun with his resolve hardening. He had threads now. Keller, his father, the nameless partner who had sat at that diner booth, he would follow them. Over the next week, Marcus pieced together what he could. He visited old truck stops, spoke with mechanics who had been young men then, sifted through newspaper archives. Again and again, the same whispers rose. Drivers who had resisted certain runs had vanished. Families had been left with silence. Police reports stamped with unresolved. Some men, though, had prospered strangely after their partners' disappearances. He followed one such name, a man who had been Keller's associate, and learned that he had retired young, moving into a house on a lakeshore, bought with money no one could explain. Marcus drove out to that lake one evening, parking across from the sprawling property. The house was new, too new to match the age of the man who owned it, with wide windows reflecting the water. The neighbors he questioned spoke in tones of grudging respect. The man was generous with donations, had built the local church a new roof, sponsored the fire department. But behind the kindness lingered unease, the kind that grows from suspicion left unvoiced. Marcus listened, taking in every detail. He knew enough to trust his instincts. Wealth that bloomed from nothing always carried a root sunk in blood or dirt. The longer he dug, the more dangerous it felt. A stranger lingering too long in truck stops, asking about events 20 years buried, drew eyes. Twice he noticed the same car trailing him down the highway. Once he came back to his apartment and found the lock scratched, the door left just ajar. He entered carefully, heart pounding, but nothing was missing. It was a message, not a robbery, a warning. Still, Marcus could not stop. He had lived his life by discipline, by refusing to let fear dictate his choices. And now he had something he had never allowed himself before, a personal stake. This was no longer about Keller alone. It was about the silence that had swallowed his own father, leaving a boy to grow into a man with questions gnawing at his bones. One night he returned to the quarry, the place where it had all begun. The water was still, moonlight painting its surface silver. He stood on the edge, remembering Keller's hollow eyes, the receipt clutched in his pouch. He had heard enough from whispers and fragments. He needed proof. If Keller had been dumped here, maybe others had too, and proof could not be silenced. He suited up quickly, his movements practiced, steady. The first shock of cold nearly stole his breath, but he pushed down into it, following the slope of the quarry's wall. His lamp cut across rocks, weeds, and the shifting silt of decades. Then he saw it metal shapes buried deeper, half hidden. Not one truck, but the ghost of another, only fragments jutting from the muck. A wheel, a twisted door, the suggestion of mass. His heart thudded hard. The quarry was not just a grave for one man. It was a dumping ground, a place chosen for its depth and secrecy. Whoever had silenced Keller had used it more than once. This was systematic, organized, bigger than a single killing. As he hovered in the water, breath rasping through his regulator, Marcus knew he had crossed a line. He was no longer just a diver documenting a wreck. He was a man standing against shadows that had lived unchallenged for decades. And he also knew that once he surfaced, there would be no turning back. When Marcus surfaced from the quarry that night, he felt as though the weight of the water had followed him back to the surface and settled deep inside his chest. His lamp had shown him what he already suspected, but seeing it with his own eyes turned suspicion into truth. Keller's truck had not been the only grave hidden beneath the black water. The outlines of another wreck, The twisted skeleton of steel buried beneath decades of muck confirmed that the quarry had been used repeatedly. It was a graveyard built not by accident, but by intention. Whoever had been behind these killings had treated the pit as a convenient eraser, burying machines and men alike under the silt. Marcus pulled himself out of the water and sat for a long time on the rocks, dripping and breathing hard. The moon hung above him like a watchful eye. He thought of Keller, strapped to his seatbelt for 20 years, and then of his father, Thomas Lawson, who had vanished without justice or explanation. If Keller's body had been found, why not his father's? Maybe the twisted wreckage he had glimpsed belonged to him. The thought hollowed Marcus in a way he could not admit even to himself. He wiped his mask with a trembling hand, packed his gear with mechanical precision, and drove back to the city with headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. He knew now that his search was not just for Keller's story, but for his own bloodline, for the father whose shadow had shaped his entire life. The following days carried a strange tension, as though the air itself pressed against him. Marcus had been watched before, but now the feeling was sharper, undeniable. The black sedan he had noticed on the highway appeared again, 2 cars back, never rushing, never too close, just steady. At the grocery store, he saw a man pretending to scan magazines who flinched when Marcus's eyes met his. His instincts, honed through years in military service, told him this was more than paranoia. Someone knew he was digging where they had buried things best left hidden. Yet fear was not enough to halt him. He began focusing on the man who had once partnered with Keller, the one whose name appeared in the archives, the one neighbors described as both generous and strange. His name was Leonard Briggs, and his wealth had bloomed quickly after Keller's disappearance. Records showed that Briggs had left long-haul trucking behind, suddenly flush with money that no one could explain. He had built a sprawling house on the edge of a lake, donated to churches and schools, and remade himself into a respectable figure of the community. Marcus drove out to the lakeside town one afternoon, choosing a day when sunlight glittered off the water and children ran down docks with fishing poles. He parked a short distance from Briggs's house and studied it. The structure was far too grand for a man who had once hauled freight across highways in a rusting rig. Wide windows gleamed, manicured lawns stretched down to the lake, and an expensive boat bobbed in its private dock. The image was of comfort, even innocence, but Marcus saw it differently. It looked like a fortress built on bones. He asked quiet questions in town, speaking to store clerks, the old man who ran the gas station, and a woman who sold bait and tackle at the lakeside shack. All spoke of Briggs's charity, of his smile, of how he had funded scholarships for local kids. But beneath their words was a hesitation, as though they knew something darker pulsed beneath the surface. One gas station attendant finally leaned in and muttered, "Funny thing, though, Briggs never worked a day after Keller went missing. Went from barely scraping by to rolling in cash overnight. You tell me how that happens." Then the man turned back to his papers, as though afraid of being overheard. That night, Marcus drove back to his apartment and found the door slightly ajar again. His heart tightened as he stepped inside, every sense sharp. Nothing had been stolen, nothing disturbed except for the thin layer of dust on the counter where a handprint now lay. A warning, subtle but unmistakable, stop. He stood in the quiet apartment for a long moment, his fists clenched, then shut the door firmly behind him. The fear that stirred in him was real, but it hardened into anger. Whoever was trying to silence him was the same kind of men who had silenced Keller, and most likely his father. He would not back down. Marcus turned his attention back to the quarry. If Briggs's wealth had grown from betrayal, if Keller had been shot and dumped for refusing to play along, then others had surely met the same fate. The second wreck he had glimpsed beneath the water haunted him. He returned at night with better lights, extra tanks, and a determination that bordered on obsession. He descended into the dark, cutting across the familiar outlines of Keller's truck until he found the other mass of twisted metal. He brushed away the silt, his gloved hands scraping over rusted steel. It was the cab of another rig, though most of it had collapsed into the quarry floor. No license plate was visible, no clear sign of who had driven it. But Marcus found what he had dreaded, the skeletal remains of a man still inside, his bones fused to the wreckage by years of water and mud. For a long time Marcus floated there, light glinting off the pale remains. His breathing echoed inside his helmet, steady but ragged. He tried to imagine the moment this man had been pushed into the depths, alive or dead, tied to his machine, erased from the surface of the world. The rage that welled up in Marcus nearly made him surface at once, but he forced himself to stay calm. He collected what evidence he could, photographing the wreck and marking its coordinates. Back on the shore, he stood shivering in the night air. There was no more denying it. The quarry was not a single grave, but a systematic dumping ground. Whoever had orchestrated this had murdered more than Keller, and the second wreck was only the beginning. The next morning, Marcus tried to bring his findings to the local authorities, but the reception chilled him more than the quarry's waters. The sheriff's office accepted his photographs and notes with perfunctory nods, their eyes flat, their voices disinterested. The sheriff himself, a broad man with a smile too easy, said, "We'll take it under advisement," and escorted Marcus out with a hand that lingered too long on his shoulder. It was clear. The department had no intention of stirring the past. They had been bought or threatened, or perhaps simply convinced it was better to leave things buried. Walking out of the station, Marcus knew he could not rely on local law. If anything, they were part of the machine that had kept Keller underwater for 2 decades. His path would have to be his own, but it was dangerous. Already he felt the pressure closing in, the eyes that tracked him, the warnings left in his apartment. Briggs and the people behind him were not content to let him sniff around forever. Marcus returned once more to the quarry at dusk, compelled despite the risk. He needed more. This time he dove deeper, searching beyond the second wreck. The quarry floor was uneven, littered with stones and logs. But after hours of searching, he found more fragments. A rusted bumper, a bent fender half buried in mud, the unmistakable outline of another machine. 3 wrecks now, 3 deaths confirmed in silence. His lamp swept across the mud, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw the glint of something metallic apart from the wreckage, a badge, or perhaps the corner of a license plate. But before he could retrieve it, his air dwindled, and he was forced to ascend. Breaking the surface, Marcus felt both triumph and dread. He had evidence that Keller's death was part of something larger, but evidence was not enough if it could vanish in the wrong hands. Briggs's shadow stretched long, and the company that had hired Marcus in the first place might have known all along what lay at the bottom of that quarry. He wiped the water from his mask, looked at the stars above, and understood he was standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. What he did not yet know was how far he would have to go, or what it would cost him to drag the truth into daylight. But he did know one thing. He was finished being silent, just as his father had once refused to bend. That choice had cost Thomas Lawson his life. Marcus could feel it now in his bones. And as he drove back through the night, his gear rattling in the trunk and his heart pounding, he accepted that the same road might await him. The drive home that night felt longer than it should have, as if the road itself were stretching under Marcus's tires, carrying him away from safety and deeper into the shadows he had chosen to pursue. His thoughts replayed the image of the skeletal remains in the second truck, the fragments of a third wreckage glimmering faintly in the mud, and the indifferent eyes of the sheriff who had dismissed his evidence as though it were little more than a fisherman's tall tale. He could not escape the conclusion anymore. The quarry had been a silent partner in murder for years, and the silence was maintained not only by those who had dumped the trucks, but also by the very people entrusted to protect the law. That realization left him in a state of quiet fury, a furnace banked but smoldering. When he entered his apartment, he half expected to find it ransacked. Instead, the same stillness greeted him, that oppressive stillness he had come to hate. It was as though the air itself whispered, warning him not to keep going, warning him that eyes watched even here, inside his own sanctuary. He set his gear down and sat in the dim light of the kitchen. On the table lay Keller's wallet, wrapped carefully in a plastic bag, the photograph of the little girl staring at him through the thin barrier. Marcus touched the plastic, thinking of the years that child must have lived without her father, and how she had likely grown up never knowing what had truly happened. His jaw tightened. He thought of his own childhood, of the long silence that had followed his father's death, and realized the cruel symmetry. Keller's daughter and he were bound by the same injustice, the same theft. The next morning, Marcus began gathering allies. He knew now that going directly to the police would be useless, and the company that had hired him had already shown its eagerness to turn a blind eye. But there were others, people who remembered, people who whispered about what had been swept under the rug. He returned to the roadside cafe where Keller had last been seen. The owner, now a man in his 70s with weathered skin and a voice like gravel, seemed startled to see Marcus again. But when Marcus laid the photograph on the counter, the old man's eyes softened. He admitted that he remembered Keller's last night vividly. He had come in for 2 coffees and sandwiches, but he had not been alone. There had been another man, tall, broad, with a cold demeanor, a man the owner later learned was Leonard Briggs. That revelation sealed the picture Marcus had already begun painting. Keller had not been the victim of random violence. He had been betrayed by his partner. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he poured Marcus a cup of coffee. "I always knew something was wrong," he confessed. "That boy never left town on his own. He was too decent for that. I never said much, but I saw the look in Briggs's eyes when he came back later. Said Keller had decided to head south. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now." Marcus left the cafe with not only a renewed sense of purpose, but also a witness who could put Briggs at the heart of that final night. Still, Marcus knew that a single testimony would not topple the fortress Briggs had built over decades. He reached out to Keller's surviving relatives, finding them through scraps of information left in the wallet. His daughter, now a grown woman with a family of her own, answered his call with cautious disbelief. When Marcus told her what he had found, her voice broke. She agreed to meet him, and when they sat together, she confessed that she had long suspected foul play, but had never had the resources to pursue it. Her testimony, her willingness to speak publicly, became another weapon in Marcus's arsenal. Yet he was under no illusions. Briggs had power, money, and friends in places that mattered. If Marcus pushed forward recklessly, all the evidence would vanish, all the voices silenced again. He needed to bring the truth into a light so bright it could not be extinguished. That meant involving the press. With careful steps, he reached out to a pair of investigative journalists known for exposing corruption. At first, they were skeptical. Stories of conspiracies and hidden graves often came from the desperate or the delusional. But when Marcus handed them the photographs from the quarry and let them hear Keller's daughter's words, their skepticism melted into cold determination. They promised him that once they verified the details, the story would run nationwide. The move was dangerous. Marcus knew that the moment Briggs and his associates sensed the story leaving their control, they would act. For days after meeting the journalists, he felt the pressure increase. Cars followed him more openly, phone calls ended with silence, and once he came home to find his oxygen tanks slashed, their contents hissing out in a deadly whisper. He stared at the ruined equipment, his anger coiling tighter, and he resolved that if they wanted to frighten him, they had miscalculated. Fear had been his companion since he was a child. It no longer ruled him. The journalists did their work quickly, and within a week the first story broke. It described Keller's body discovered underwater, the suspicions of foul play, and the implications of multiple wrecks in the quarry. Photographs of the rusted trucks filled the page, alongside Keller's driver's license photo, a face pulled from the past to demand justice. The article spread faster than Marcus expected, picked up by larger outlets, and soon federal authorities could not ignore it. The sheriff's office, so quick to dismiss him before, now faced pressure from above. Questions were asked in public forums, reporters knocked on Briggs's front door, and whispers turned to shouts. Briggs himself tried to maintain the facade. He appeared at a church service, smiling and shaking hands. But Marcus watched the footage on television and saw the stiffness in his gestures, the flicker of unease in his eyes. The fortress was cracking. Still, Marcus knew men like Briggs did not crumble quietly. He expected retaliation, and it came swiftly. One evening, as Marcus returned from meeting the journalists again, a black SUV pulled up beside him. Two men stepped out, their intent clear. Marcus's training surged back into him, and though the confrontation was brutal, he survived it, leaving his attackers broken in the alley. He understood the message, but he also understood something deeper. Briggs was desperate. Desperation meant the truth was close to breaking through. The federal authorities eventually moved in. The quarry was declared a crime scene, dredges brought in to recover the wrecks Marcus had marked. News cameras captured the grim spectacle as more skeletons were lifted from the depths, proof that Keller's death had been only one of many. The silence that had lasted for decades shattered in a single week of headlines. Briggs was taken into custody, his empire unraveling in front of the same community he had once deceived with donations and false smiles. For Marcus, the victory was not triumphant, but solemn. He stood at the edge of the quarry one last time, watching as divers in federal uniforms did what he had done alone in the dark. The water no longer looked like an enemy to him, but like a witness finally allowed to speak. He felt the presence of Keller, of the others, and most of all, of his father. Though he could not yet prove that one of the wrecks belonged to Thomas Lawson, he knew in his heart that the same hands had taken them both. In bringing the truth into daylight, he had honored not only Keller's memory, but his father's as well. The journalists wanted to paint him as a hero, but Marcus resisted the label. He told them he was only a man who refused to keep quiet, a man who went looking for answers because silence was unbearable. When they asked if he would keep diving, he only smiled faintly. The water was still his element, but it no longer represented escape. Now it represented the weight of lives lost and voices stolen. On his final descent into the quarry, this time as an official consultant for the federal team, Marcus felt the cold embrace of the depths wrap around him again. But instead of fear, he felt calm. The beam of his lamp cut through the murk, illuminating silt and wreckage, and he realized that though the quarry had been a grave for so long, it was now something else. It was testimony. Every rusted bolt, every shattered window, every bone pulled from the mud was a word in a story that could no longer be silenced. When he surfaced, the sun was rising over the water, painting the ripples gold. Marcus pulled off his mask, breathing deeply of the morning air. He knew the fight had cost him, had marked him forever, but he also knew that some battles were worth the scars. He had restored voices to the voiceless, dragged truth out of the dark, and in that rising sun he felt a measure of peace that had eluded him his entire life. The quarry would never again be just a pit of water and stone. For Marcus, it had become the place where silence ended and truth surfaced. Don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking story. Check out more unbelievable videos waiting for you on this channel and share this one with your friends so they can discover the truth too.